Twisted Beige, a roleplay brought to audio. Hibiki's perspective. For all his trepidation, Hibiki's reception ceremony had been anticlimactic and short-lived. Professor Ash had barely looked at him before filling something out on a roster and nodding to an aide, who in turn gave him a handful of starter material, including a Pokeball presumably containing Charmander. Noticing several empty slots in the Pokeball carton on the table, Hibiki asked timidly if other delegates for the Red Journey had already been through. To this, Professor Ash looked at him skeptically, as if wanting to roll his eyes at the stupidity of the question. But he seemed to think better of it, and told Hibiki that they were already gone, and that he'd better hurry if he planned on traveling with his companions. "I'll spare you the orientation," he added, turning back to his computer screen. "You guys know the drill by now. Red's all but beaten it into your heads. Just don't be late to the next city, or the people may wonder what happened to you." Hibiki left the lab, slightly disillusioned, not even bothering to check out his new Charmander. In the back of his mind, he was certain that Red had felt more excited than this on his journey. Well, all things considered, it might have gone worse. A distant smashing sound caught his attention just as he entered the grasslands of North Pallet, and he turned around just in time to see something plunge through the window of Ash's lab. "Holy!" Heart pounding, he shaded his eyes and tried to get a better look, but couldn't make out what was happening. There was the sound of raised voices, which just barely drifted to his ears over the distance, but no intelligible words. Someone had broken into the lab, not 10 minutes after he'd gotten his Fire-type starter. Forget Red's journey, this was turning out to be more like Gold's, when the exact same thing had happened with Silver. Gold had been by himself, though, with nobody to share the news. Further up ahead, however, Hibiki could see a young man and woman facing off with their own starters, a Charmander and a Bulbasaur, and he was certain that they were part of the group that had gone just before him. He hastened forward. If they were battling, he knew better than to disrupt it, but afterward he would reveal what he'd seen. If nothing else, it was a segue into acquainting himself with them. Mason's perspective. 3 Pidgeys and 5 Rattatas later, Mason noticed 2 distant figures, battling it seemed. At advancing, he recognized the trainers as the others from the lab. They were already battling? He looked down at Bubbles with a huff. Although he ignored the match ahead of him, even with walking, he couldn't take his eyes off of it. They were both using their starters, which he assumed meant that they had yet to catch anything either. It was a really bad habit of his, comparing his progress to that of his peers. Then from out of the blue, a large Pidgey swooped down and caught the Squirtle from Mason's arms. At realizing it wasn't a bug, the Pidgey dropped Bubbles, who retreated into his shell. "Tail Whip!" commanded Mason, who had gotten down to the basics of battling. The Pidgey glared at Bubbles before swooping in for a tackle. Pidgey hit Bubbles' shell, which hardly affected the Pokemon. "Water Gun!" Mason yelled out at his companion's newly learned move with a burst of enthusiasm. The strong squirt of water successfully hit the flying type, who fell to the ground, unable to flap its soaked wings. In that moment, the first of Mason's Pokeballs left his hand and blinked after sucking in the opposing Pokemon. It then blinked again, before settling. Mason's mouth hung open as he stared at the ball and his tired partner, and then he practically slid across the dirt to Bubbles, who he brought into a hug, before patting his head with a chuckle. "At this rate, He paused in thought before grinning with a shrug and standing up to pick up the stray Pokeball. He then tossed it into the air and caught it, which sent out the Pidgey that he had figured was quite oversized. The bird glared at Mason before clawing rather viciously. It then returned its gaze to the ground, as if in search for something. Mason watched his new Pokemon before shrugging. He scanned it with his Pokédex to gather more information. Finally, getting to his feet, the boy smiled. "Welcome to the team, Bullseye!" The Pidgey looked up before hopping towards Mason, who returned it. Chris's perspective. Chris laughed at Karma. "Dodge it, and then use Growl!" he yelled. Inferno dodged it in a nick of time, and then let out a loud cry which lowered Pan's attack. Even though Karma went first, Chris studied a lot about the starters. He remembered that Bulbasaur had a lower attack than Charmander, so if they exchanged the same attacks, Inferno should win. However, Charmander had less defense than Bulbasaur. It doesn't matter, though, because Chris had a trick up his sleeve. Karma's perspective. I was right, Karma mumbled as she watched her opponent finally make a move. This kid is a brat, she whispered, low enough that her opponent couldn't hear her. Hey, bud. Pan looked at her curiously. Do you have any birth moves? Pan blinked, confused as to what she'd asked, until she traced an oval shape in the air. Pan nodded. Good, Karma said, before looking at the Charmander. Use Growl! Hibiki's perspective. All around Hibiki, starter Pokemon of Indigo, Azure, and Jade swept through the grass in a wild dance of combat. The blend of color and speed caught him in a sort of phantasmagorical circus, where beauty and danger melded and invoked a primal thrill. Suddenly, Hibiki found he had forgotten the lab break-in at present, for here was the reason Gold had put him up to the Pokemon journey. This was what the trainer's life was all about, and all he had to do was dive into the waiting embrace of adventure. He raised high his capsule ball, that which secreted the first flame of his newborn trainer's spirit. Charmander, come out! In a burst of light, the petite fire lizard emerged, and Hibiki motioned around with a sweep of his arm. It's time to join the fray, he announced matter-of-factly, as he'd seen Gold do with his own Pokemon. The thing was, they might not have understood your language, but they'd understand your tone and posture. Be alert. We have a long road ahead of us before we can call ourselves strong. Return fire if anything jumps out at us, and let's see if we can nab an early teammate. He couldn't have guessed how much time had passed in the blur of action that followed. Charmander was jumped multiple times by minuscule Pokemon, most of them field rats and pigeons. He took bludgeoning blows from their attacks, and bit and scratched in retaliation, dropping most foes in 2 or 3 hits. At one point, the little salamander learned to swing his flame tail, which dealt special fire damage and downed enemy Pokemon much quicker. Hibiki wasted 2 Pokeballs trying to catch a Pidgey with Sand Attack, then gave up when Charmander chased it off in a panic, returning with feathers sticking in his teeth. He sighed and pulled out a spray potion to heal his Pokemon's various peck wounds. At the height of its battle frenzy, Hibiki learned that his Charmander probably had a rash nature. It saw a blue tail poking out of the grass, and, caught up in the moment, dashed forward and chomped down. There was a strangled cry, and then the Pokemon leapt from the high grass. A Squirtle. Hibiki felt a jolt of realization, then scurried up to pull Charmander away. Gah! No, not that one! Friendly fire! He glanced up, in time to see the young man standing just a few feet away, who, no doubt, was its trainer. Hibiki inclined his head in apology. Sorry, he's still a little wild. He held out his hand. You're one of the guys on the journey, right? I'm Hibiki. I'll make sure Charmander doesn't do that again, so no harm, no foul? Beige's perspective. Beige ran through Route 1. The Pokemon there were too weak for him. He accelerated as fast as a Rapidash, and he looked up at the colossal buildings and skyscrapers that had recently been installed into Viridian City. He was back here again. Looking around, he realized that he had avoided the other trainers. He looked back to see them. At that point, Beige was indecisive on what to do. He looked back again and ran towards them. Really, he wanted to befriend them and tell them the truth. Beige had done some digging and found some strange things out about Red. He wanted to stand out to them, and he wanted them to follow him. Those are some weak-looking Pokemon, Beige said to the trainers. His voice was not very loud, as he did not want to get caught by the enforcers, who he also knew about. His voice was like a whisper, almost. Karma's perspective. Karma flinched as she looked at the newcomer. Did you say something? She asked curiously, as she eyed the boy. He looked to be a native in Kanto, but certainly not around Pallet Town. She looked back at her battle, then back at the boy again. Hey, Chris, was it? This is your win, she said loud enough for her opponent to hear. Pan made his way towards his trainer, curious as to why she would give up like that. Karma bent down to pick up the Bulbasaur before she grabbed the 125 Pokédollars and made her way towards Chris. She shoved it into his hand, just like how she shoved the set of items at him. It's not enough to get you a Pokéball, but hey, at least you get a reward, she said, as she made her way back to the new trainer. What were you saying again? Oh, sorry. I'm Karma, and this is Pan. What's your name? She asked, as Pan gave a little wave at the boy. Beige's perspective. Beige laughed, almost silently, to himself. You expect me to have a name? Like everyone else on this Arceus-forsaken planet? Beige walked around Karma to inspect her. All I have to say is, your mind is about to be blown. The things I know, they're in your wildest dreams, he shouted. Beige pulled down the hood of his similarly beige hoodie and put on a beige cap. Red isn't who you think he is. His regime is built on a lie. Then Beige turned around and started walking back up the hill to Viridian. He laughed again. You'll all see. We're the only ones who can know this. He continued walking. And by the way, the name's Beige, he yelled. Beige spotted a pair of enforcers running up the hill. They looked like a cross between police officers and army soldiers, with green jungle camouflage trousers and blue caps, with muscular builds and armor. They saw Beige and ran after him. That must be him, one of them exclaimed. He fits Professor Ash's description. I'll go after him. The other one nodded and stayed behind. Trainers, he shouted at the particular bunch who had been with Beige. What do you know of the boy you just encountered? We've had reports of him breaking into the Pallet Town laboratory and stealing an illegal starter. Karma's perspective. What? Then we have to go after him, Karma proclaimed as she went to run after the boy. She passed through the other enforcers, despite them having longer legs and being adults. Guess having to run away from your mother most of your life can be pretty handy. She chuckled at the thought. She stopped to realize that she couldn't really do anything with only Pan on her team. She clicked her tongue and rerouted to the nearest tall grass. She scanned the area until she saw a tree with a hole in it. She looked back and saw the guards and Beige were still in their game of catch the Rattata. She set Pan down and grabbed a pebble, then threw it at the tree. She would usually avoid things like this, but she had to know. She grabbed another pebble and threw it at the tree, and finally, at her third throw, a Pidgey flew out. It glared at her before it dived down to her with the intent of teaching her a lesson. But as the Pidgey got closer, Karma suddenly shouted her command. Grab it with your vines, Pan! The seed Pokemon did as told, and a pair of vines appeared from its bulb before it shot out towards the Pidgey. The Pidgey at first was able to maneuver through the vines, but fortunately, Pan was able to wrap his vines at the tiny bird Pokemon. Pan brought down the Pidgey as Karma took out a Pokeball. Look, I'm really sorry for disturbing you, but I just really need your help. Don't worry, I'll release you as soon as we're done, she said, before she tapped the Pokeball on the Pidgey's head. The Pokeball shook once, twice, and it stayed shut after that, indicating she had caught the Pidgey. Karma sighed in relief before she took out Pan's Pokeball. Sorry, bud, but I'll run faster if you'll stay in the Pokeball. The Bulbasaur nodded in understanding, which caused Karma to smile at it. Sorry. With that, she returned her Pokemon to his Pokeball. She turned and ran back to where the guards and Beige had gone. She saw the guards and immediately ran beside them. She took out her Pidgey, who flew beside her. Hey, kid, what? Karma turned away from them, her eyes focused on Beige's back, and thought of what she had said before. She didn't really worship Red, but her mother did, which disgusted her in so many ways. Maybe that's why she didn't really see Red as someone to be worshipped or respected, because her mother respected and worshipped him. What a childish bias she had. Pidgey, sand attack to blind the enemy! The Pidgey rose through the air before flapping its wings, creating a huge dust cloud. But Karma was ready. She took off her arm warmers and covered her nose and mouth with it. The guards hadn't noticed, but the dust cloud only covered them and not Beige. Karma sped up to get out of the dust cloud, leaving her enemies in the dust. Gotta love puns at the wrong time. She blocked Beige's way. Wait, what do you mean about Red? I want to know, and don't worry, if you think I'm one of those who worship the guy, I'm not.